first is a very good friend of mine. Went to Merchant Marine Academy, I believe. Got in the merchant marine business, but he's been a Naval Reserve officer for many years as a naval officer. He's right here, Robert Lansden. I want to tell you a little bit more. He'll tell you the full story. There's two major things events in his life that I want him to pass on to you. I'm not even mentioning he has twice run statewide office in this state. That's statewide. He's a captain in the Navy, U.S. Navy, and he was here in Katrina, and believe me, he'll be embarrassed when I tell you, he is one of the heroes of Katrina. Please welcome Captain Robert Lansden.
Thank you for having me. It's important that I share with you right away that I was a student of naval history. And it's because I'm the son of a naval officer. Captain Baylor Lansden, World War II generation. And he fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And I grew up along his side and along men that he knew, like Captain Lawrence, Admiral Reiner. And I grew up in a generation where listening to him and what many of you did in World War II and earlier wars, when the leader in front of you was lost or killed, or when the leader in front of you or you couldn't get a hold of, you stood up. You stood up and you did what was right. And the story I'm going to tell you about Katrina, and to some degree in Iraq, is the development of a generation and a culture where we wait to hear from orders. We wait to get the email, we wait to get the communication, and that's not how I grew up. And it was because of Captain Baylor Lansden, and quite frankly, I didn't know about the naval order, but the preservation of naval history that I learned how to make a difference and how to be a leader. And that's what you all are, and that's why you're preserving naval history. Because in theory, we're not supposed to repeat history. We're supposed to learn from it and make a difference. So with that, I want to talk to you. I want to advance quickly to Hurricane Katrina, because that's part of the core of the story. But now come to August 28th, 2005. I actually have a ship over in the river, a 1,000-foot ship. It's part of what's called a military sea lift command. And some of you, I believe the Army Transportation Corps kind of morphed into, and I won't go into all the history, y'all probably know it better than I, but the military sea lift command had, and still has, vessels that support the Navy. And this was one of those vessels. And originally they were called SL-7s. They were commercial ships, but they were converted. And they do 35 knots. They're the fastest cargo ships. Now, there's some people that have small little boats that they call them cargo ships, but I'm talking about a cargo ship. They can carry over 600-700 vehicles, can do 37 knots. Well, they carry a tremendous amount of fuel, and that's why I wanted to share that note with you. So, I'm on a ship, and I was asked to come down to take command of it. It was going to be in repairs, and I wanted that because my father had just had a heart attack, and he was in a hospital on the West Bank, 10 minutes from the ship, and I was going to be close to Dad. Meanwhile, there was a hurricane coming to hit Florida, Pensacola, as a matter of fact, and it was called Hurricane Katrina. And I, as a good officer, a lot of my crew asked to go over to Florida and other locations to take care of their families, and overnight that storm shifted. All the other ships sail, and any good sailor knows you don't sit at the dock in a hurricane. And the sister ship next to me, the good captain was waving goodbye, and my brother was giving me phone calls like, well, we're going to see in the news with your ship beached on the French Quarter, right? This is my brother, right? And I imagined that, and quite frankly, a 1,000-foot ship built in Germany with the thickness of the steel, actually, if we sank, we would have shut down the river probably for a year. Anyway, number one was to save the ship and crew. I did all the good seaworthy things that we had to do, ballast down. We had our generators going, and we put every line out in the world and anchors down. But when Katrina hit, it even surprised us. And so that night it started, and I was at a memorial service recently, and a lot of you have heard of about the El Faro. But the one thing I can tell you, in a storm, and we recorded 140 knot winds on my vessel, but it tore off antennas, it tore off loose pieces of metal. That's what a storm does. And so the storm ends, and the unique thing about Katrina was so long, right? I just came to Houston. Patricia was big, but Patricia's rolling on through. Katrina rocked for over 8 hours. It vibrated buildings to the point where they fell. It was a tremendous force. Well, we survived it. And quite frankly, when the sun was setting and I saw it the next morning, I could contribute that to God. And I said to myself, Lord, you've saved the ship, you've saved my crew, and now it's time to save a city. And the next day we did that. We went out first to the hospitals. My dad had been evacuated, but I turn out, I get there, and the hospital was 3 hours left on their emergency generator with fuel. Their patients that had dialysis were dying. And I said, look, I got a 1,000-foot ship. We got water, we got fuel. So we started to bring the patients to the ship to treat them. We got a small tanker truck we spotted with the National Guard. We got them fuel so WestJet could keep going. And that's how it started, and it built. And I gotta tell you, everywhere I went, it was just like miraculous. People were at the end of the rope, and there was no really thought of how long the city would be out, so no one had over a day's fuel in their generators. So hospitals had this problem all over. Pumps that evacuated, pumped out the city, they had no fuel. The buses that evacuated the people later had no fuel. Well, remember I told you we do 37 knots. We had over 1.5 million gallons of diesel on our ship. Now we're not a tanker, but I had some good engineers reverse the pumps. We eventually built a pipeline down the levee, and it was one tanker truck after another. And it was working. And because I am from New Orleans, I knew the vital resources to get them to. But on the third day, and Gary reminded me of this story, you know, after 10 years, you kind of forget. Well, the first thing is I had a Navy representative come and tell me that I was giving away government fuel and that I could be thrown in the brig for it. And I said, well, you can either have breakfast here or you can go back down the gangway. Well, he had breakfast and he was quiet. And he was quiet until midnight that night when he asked me, because he got a phone call, a little text from his wife, who was a nurse. Baptist Hospital is a hospital uptown and had been completely flooded out. And a lot of the nurses, they evacuated to the convention center. And I don't know how much you know about this area, but the big centers for where people were was the Superdome and the convention center. Now, supposedly there's only 500 people at the convention center. He's up in my office and he starts to cry. You gotta rescue my wife. There's 3 nurses hiding in a truck. There's burning cars all around them. And there's violent people outside. What do? You do the right thing. I've been given fuel to the National Guard. I went out to them and I said, look, I need a Humvee. We need to go save these women. One sergeant, and many of you all have done this before, sometimes you just got to do what's right. You can't go up asking for permission. We got the Humvee, and we used one of our trucks, and we went to the convention center. And I arrived at the convention center, and there's police cars burning. And if you've ever been to a Mardi Gras parade or been in a big crowd, we come around and our lights, it's like waking up, it's like Dawn of the Dead. There was 10, 20 people deep, there was thousands of people. We stopped in front of that mail truck, which happens to be by the burning police car. And we're surrounded. We are surrounded by some really aggressive people. Meanwhile, my chief engineer is getting the women out. And this good sergeant with the National Guard, Sergeant Kennedy, starts talking real loud and firm. We load and we jump in and drive right through them. When I'm driving back across the bridge, I'm like, what did you say? I don't even remember what was so significant about how you did that. He said, look, I'm a guard in Pineville. He's a prison guard. He's been a prison guard for 20 years. And he's used to talking aggressive to aggressive people. And these were aggressive people, and they parted. And we, long story short, we got the nurses out. We communicated out how bad it was at the convention center. What had happened was they only had 12 National Guardsmen at the convention center. And when it got so crowded and they were being assaulted, they left. And you had good people who were sent there. But like any chaotic situation, you had bad people, and they began to rule. And there was a lot of bad things that happened in the city, but at least we were able to get some people out and notify and start changing that area. But the long story of it, which is now a short story because I have to be quick, I had a team of sailors that were unique. And many of you have been on ships. You've got engineers, you've got medical people, you've got cooks. My poor steward must have fed 30,000 people over a month's period. How did we do that? Well, on another day we went, because no one was bringing us food, we went and took it. We actually went to the Walmart out on the West Bank. We ended up saving that Walmart. The manager who was evacuating the place said, look, I don't have any fuel. I got to shut this down. They're looting my stores. I said, well, I got fuel for you. And he said, really? I said, here's the deal. I want all the food I can get. And I need clean clothes for my sailors, because the other thing is we couldn't use water, so my sailors kept shopping at Walmart for free, and that was all right. One funny story, the steward thought he would start decorating the rooms, and I'm starting to see like leopard skin towels inside clothes. Yeah, because we started to get some nurses to stay on the ship, so. Anyway, we were in the right place at the right time, but I'm back to leadership. I met groups of firefighters, I met groups of policemen who were all waiting for orders from the mayor, and they hadn't heard, and they couldn't move. They didn't want to violate orders. And I said, look, you need fuel, come out. We need to make a difference. And I later met a group of firefighters that they did a day later. But the thing is that in leadership, you've got to make the right decision. I was never thrown in the Navy brig. I even had later, FEMA shows up on the 7th day, and they say, you know, we understand you're running a fuel operation, we're taking it over. And I said, well, this is a government vessel, and it's owned by the United States Navy, and not only are you not taking it over, but every fuel truck you bring, I'm personally directing where it's going. And you're going to ask me about it, and if it's a good place to go, I'm going to let you go there. But if it's not, and that was important because I was from here. But as any good leader knows, or military officer, there's certain things you want to stand up first. You know, I love the zoo and the aquarium, which we've helped eventually, but that's not the first priority. Okay. You know, the first priority is people, and that's where we hit first, and the hospitals, okay? Next, help them evacuate, and we're gonna evacuate the city, and we did. I brought my engineers down in the aquarium, the fish were dying, we actually worked on their compressors and their generator to save some fish. But there are priorities in everything you do, and that was getting lost in New Orleans. So anyway, the crew was amazing. They did an amazing job. And the biggest part of that was because they knew I had their back. They had a leader that was going to take care of them and cared about them. And I passionately care about this city. And so I'm excited. You're seeing a city rebuilt, and it's alive. I mean, it's growing more than ever. And there's good people back here. And I'm just delighted that you could have your convention here and be a